Dorothy Miller had always believed that life in Prairie Creek, South Dakota moved as slowly and predictably as the changing seasons. For 74 years, she'd watched the same golden wheat fields bend beneath cloudless skies, heard the same meadowlarks herald each dawn, and known every face that passed her weathered front porch. But on a sweltering July evening in 2024, as the sun painted the endless prairie sky in watercolor shades of amber and rose, something changed in her small corner of the world. The sleek black Range Rover looked absurdly out of place as it glided down Main Street, its polished surface reflecting the fading daylight like a mirror. Dorothy's arthritic fingers paused in their endless knitting as she watched the vehicle slow to a crawl before turning onto Old Mill Road, a dusty track that led to nowhere except the abandoned Blackwood property. "Now, what do you make of that, Mr. Whiskers?" she murmured to her elderly ginger cat, who dozed contentedly in his usual spot beside her rocking chair. The cat offered no response beyond a slight twitch of his tail, but Dorothy hardly noticed. Her pale blue eyes, still sharp despite her years, remained fixed on the disappearing vehicle. The Blackwood farm had stood empty for nearly a decade, its Victorian architecture slowly surrendering to the relentless prairie winds and harsh Dakota winters. The last time anyone had lived there was when old Thomas Blackwood still drew breath, and he'd been dead since 2014, leaving behind nothing but a crumbling house full of memories and a mountain of unpaid taxes. Yet here was this expensive vehicle, crawling down that forgotten road like a black beetle against the golden prairie grass. More curious still was what Dorothy glimpsed through its tinted windows: a man in what appeared to be an expensive suit, and beside him, a small figure that could only be a child. "Strange days indeed," Dorothy muttered, returning to her knitting with mechanical precision while her mind churned with questions. In Prairie Creek, population 1.247, new faces were rare enough to merit discussion. Mysterious strangers in luxury vehicles, heading to abandoned properties at sunset? That was unprecedented. The next evening found Dorothy in her usual spot, though she dragged her rocking chair a few inches closer to the porch railing for a better view of Old Mill Road. Mr. Whiskers had relocated to accommodate this change, stretching his elderly frame across the weathered floorboards nearby, right on schedule. Just as the sun began its nightly descent, the Range Rover appeared again. This time, Dorothy was ready with her husband's old binoculars, a relic from his birdwatching days. Through the powerful lenses, she could make out more details. The driver was indeed wearing a suit, charcoal gray and expertly tailored, his dark hair showing traces of distinguished silver at the temples. The child beside him was a girl, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, wearing what appeared to be a cream-colored dress, her dark hair arranged in neat braids. They made an odd pair, Dorothy thought, especially in this setting. The man carried himself with the kind of confidence that spoke of corporate boardrooms and expensive restaurants, not dusty Dakota backroads. And the little girl, there was something about her that nagged at Dorothy's instincts, honed by 40 years of nursing at Prairie Creek General Hospital before her retirement. The child sat too still, her posture too rigid for someone her age. Even from a distance, there was a gravity about her that seemed wrong somehow, like a shadow falling across what should have been carefree childhood days. The Tall Grass Diner had been serving the same menu since 1962, and Martha Jenkins had been serving coffee there nearly as long. At 78, she was one of the few people in Prairie Creek who could claim seniority over Dorothy. And the two women had been friends since their children attended the same kindergarten class decades ago. "So," Martha said the next morning, sliding a cup of coffee across the worn Formica counter, "I hear you've taken up bird watching." Her tone made it clear she wasn't talking about actual birds. Dorothy added her usual splash of cream before responding. "Interesting things flying around Old Mill Road these days." Martha leaned forward, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper despite the nearly empty diner. Sarah Thompson from the grocery store said she saw them yesterday. Man in an expensive suit, buying enough canned goods and supplies to last months. Paid cash. Barely said a word. The girl was with him? Martha nodded. Quiet as a mouse, she said. Pretty little thing in a cream dress. But something odd about her. Wouldn't make eye contact. Stayed close to the man like she was scared of something. Dorothy frowned, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. Did Sarah catch a name? He paid cash. Remember? No credit card. No check. Nothing to trace. But get this, they're staying at the old Blackwood place. Billy Reynolds was out there fixing fences for the Carson Ranch. Saw lights in the windows last night. The news sent a ripple of unease through Dorothy. The Blackwood house had been condemned years ago, deemed unsafe for habitation after the roof partially collapsed during a particularly harsh winter. What kind of man would bring a child to live in such conditions? Especially one who clearly had the means to afford better? There's something not right about this whole situation, Dorothy said finally, pushing her half-finished coffee aside. That house isn't fit for rats, let alone a little girl. Martha's lined face creased with concern. You thinking what I'm thinking? Should we call someone? Sheriff, maybe? Dorothy considered this for a long moment. In her years of nursing, she'd seen enough cases of abuse and neglect to develop a sixth sense about such things. But she'd also learned the importance of gathering facts before making accusations that could destroy lives. Let's wait, she decided finally. Watch and gather more information. Something's obviously wrong here, but we need to be sure about what before we start making calls. Martha nodded slowly. Well, if anyone can figure out what's going on, it's you. You always did have a nose for trouble and a heart for helping people out of it. As July melted into August, the mystery of the man and girl at the Blackwood place only deepened. Their routine never varied. They would arrive each evening just before sunset, the Range Rover's tinted windows reflecting the dying light, and leave before dawn the next day. During daylight hours, the old house stood silent and seemingly abandoned, its broken windows staring blindly across the prairie like empty eyes. Dorothy began keeping a journal, noting times, dates, and any variations in the pattern. Her daughter Linda, during their weekly phone calls from Rapid City, thought she was becoming obsessed. Mom, you're turning into one of those nosy small-town busybodies, Linda said during one such call. Maybe they just value their privacy. Not everyone wants their business spread all over town. Privacy is one thing, Dorothy replied, watching through her window as the familiar black vehicle made its nightly journey down Old Mill Road. But something about this isn't right. Linda, I can feel it in my bones. Your bones also predict rain with questionable accuracy, Linda teased. Just be careful, okay? Don't go doing anything crazy. But Dorothy's concern only grew as summer progressed. Through her binoculars, she began noticing subtle changes. The man's expensive suits started showing signs of wear, his confident posture gradually giving way to something more hunched and defensive. The little girl's cream-colored dress, while still clean and pressed, was beginning to look slightly too small, as if she were growing but unable to replace it. Then came the night that changed everything. It was a stormy evening in late August, the kind of night when the prairie wind howled like a lost soul and lightning painted jagged patterns across the coal-black sky. Dorothy sat in her darkened living room, watching through the rain-streaked window as not one but two vehicles made their way down Old Mill Road. The first was the familiar Range Rover. The second, appearing about 20 minutes later, was a silver Mercedes with out-of-state plates. Through the curtain of rain, Dorothy watched as two men emerged from the Mercedes, their dark suits and grim expressions visible even in the poor light. The conversation that followed was brief but intense. Even through the storm, Dorothy could see the aggressive gestures, the way the two men crowded the Range Rover's driver against the weathered porch of the old house. The little girl was nowhere in sight, presumably inside, but Dorothy could imagine her fear at overhearing such a confrontation. When the men finally departed, the Range Rover's driver remained standing in the rain for several long moments, his shoulders slumped in what looked unmistakably like defeat. Something about that image, a man alone in the storm, Carrying what was clearly an overwhelming burden stirred Dorothy's heart in a way she hadn't expected. "Well, Mr. Whiskers," she said to her sleeping cat, "I think it's time we did more than just watch." The next morning dawned clear and cool, with the kind of crisp air that hinted at autumn's approach. Dorothy spent the morning baking her special apple pie with a touch of cinnamon and nutmeg, a recipe that had won the county fair blue ribbon 3 years running. As the pie cooled on her windowsill, she considered her approach. Direct confrontation had always been her style during her nursing days. She'd found that most problems couldn't be solved through hints and subtle suggestions. Sometimes you had to walk straight into the storm and offer shelter to those caught in it. When evening approached, Dorothy packed the still warm pie into a basket, added a quart of fresh milk from the Carson dairy, and set out for the Blackwood place. The Range Rover was already parked behind the house when she arrived, its glossy surface dulled by a layer of prairie dust. The porch steps creaked ominously under her feet as she approached the front door. Close, the house's deterioration was even more apparent: peeling paint, rotting wood, windows patched with cardboard where glass should have been. How desperate must someone be, she wondered, to choose this over other options? Her knock echoed through the empty rooms beyond. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then the sound of cautious footsteps. The door opened just enough to reveal the man's face, his expression a mixture of surprise and wariness. Close, Dorothy could see the toll recent events had taken dark circles under his eyes, lines of stress around his mouth, his expensive suit showing signs of having been slept in. "Good evening," Dorothy said, holding up the basket like a peace offering. "I'm Dorothy Miller from down the road. I thought it was about time I properly welcomed you to Prairie Creek." The man hesitated, his eyes darting past Dorothy to scan the empty road before returning to her face. "Thank you, but this really isn't a good time. In my experience," Dorothy interrupted gently, channeling the tone she'd used countless times with nervous patience. "There's never a perfect time for important conversations, and I think we both know that whatever's happening here, you could use someone to talk to." Something in her voice, perhaps the blend of authority and compassion, seemed to reach him. After another long moment, he stepped back, opening the door wider. "I'm Michael," he said quietly. "Michael Harrison, and this isn't what it looks like." The interior of the Blackwood house was better than Dorothy had expected, though that wasn't saying much. The front room had been cleaned thoroughly, with basic furniture arranged to create a semblance of normalcy. A table, some chairs, a small cot in the corner, battery-powered lanterns provided light, and a camping stove sat in what had once been a grand fireplace. The little girl sat at the table, working on what appeared to be schoolwork by lamplight. She looked up as Dorothy entered, her dark eyes wary but curious. "This is Sophie," Michael said, his voice softening as he looked at the child. "My daughter." Dorothy set her basket on the table, noting how Sophie's eyes followed the movement. "Well, Sophie," she said warmly, "I hope you like apple pie. It's still warm from the oven." For the first time, a flicker of genuine interest crossed the child's face. "Really? Really?" Dorothy confirmed. "And I brought some fresh milk too. Can't have pie without milk. That's practically a law in South Dakota." Michael watched this exchange with a mixture of gratitude and apprehension. As Dorothy began cutting generous slices of pie, he remained standing, his posture tense. "Mrs. Miller." "Dorothy," she corrected firmly. "Dorothy," he amended. "I appreciate your kindness, but you should know that being associated with us, it could be complicated." Dorothy handed Sophie a slice of pie and a glass of milk before turning to face Michael directly. "Life is complicated, Mr. Harrison. That's why we have neighbors, to help uncomplicate it a bit. Now, why don't you sit down and have some pie while you tell me what kind of trouble you're in?" Over the next hour, as the prairie sunset painted the room in shades of gold and purple, Michael's story emerged. He had indeed been wealthy once, a successful investment banker in Chicago with all the trappings of success. but a series of increasingly risky investments, made initially to cover losses from a market downturn, had spiraled out of control. "I thought I could fix it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "One big deal, one lucky break, and everything would be fine. Instead, I just dug myself deeper." Sophie, who had finished her pie and was now curled up on the cot with a book, appeared to be ignoring the conversation. But Dorothy noticed how she tensed at certain points in her father's narrative. "The worst part wasn't losing everything," Michael continued. "It was discovering who I'd actually borrowed from. These aren't banks or legitimate investors. They're dangerous people who don't care about legal processes or bankruptcy protection. The men from last night," Dorothy said quietly. Michael's head snapped up. "You saw them." "I see most things that happen on Old Mill Road," Dorothy replied calmly, though usually from a bit more of a distance. A ghost of a smile crossed Michael's face. "I thought I felt someone watching us. I guess in your position, I would have done the same." "So you ran?" Dorothy prompted gently. Michael nodded. "When they started making threats, when they mentioned Sophie," his voice broke slightly. "She's all I have left. Her mother died when she was 3. I couldn't let them use her to get to me." Dorothy looked at Sophie, understanding now the sadness she'd seen in the child's eyes. This was a girl carrying the weight of adult fears, trying to be brave for her father's sake. "We still have our house in Chicago," Michael continued, "but it's not safe there. They're watching it. I found this place by accident, saw it was abandoned, isolated. We sleep here at night, spend days driving around to different towns so no one gets too suspicious. Sophie does her schoolwork online when we can find Wi-Fi. And you're slowly running out of money and options." Dorothy finished for him. Michael's shoulders slumped. "The men last night, they're getting closer. I don't know how much longer we can keep running." Dorothy was quiet for a long moment, processing everything she'd heard. In her years of nursing, she'd learned to trust her instincts about people. Michael Harrison might be a man who'd made terrible mistakes, but he wasn't a criminal, just a desperate father trying to protect his child. "Well," she said finally, setting down her empty pie plate, "I think it's about time we got you two properly settled." Michael looked at her in confusion. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Dorothy said firmly, "that living in a condemned house and driving around all day is no way to raise a child. I have a perfectly good guest room, 2 of them, actually sitting empty since my Harold passed. No one would think to look for you there." "Mrs. Miller," Dorothy, "I couldn't possibly." "You can and you will," Dorothy interrupted. "Prairie Creek takes care of its own, even if they're just passing through. Besides," she added with a small smile, "Mr. Whiskers could use some company besides a chatty old woman." Sophie had abandoned any pretense of reading and was watching the conversation intently, hope flickering in her eyes for the first time since Dorothy had met her. "But your reputation," Michael protested weakly. "If those men come looking—" "My reputation?" Dorothy chuckled. "Young man, I've lived in this town for 74 years. I've delivered babies, tended the sick, and sat with the dying. I've seen every family's secrets and kept them all. Trust me, I can handle a few threatening men in expensive suits." The transformation over the next few months was remarkable to witness. Under Dorothy's protective wing, Michael and Sophie slowly began to rebuild their lives. The guest rooms, unused since Linda moved to Rapid City, came alive with the sounds of family again. Sophie's cream dress was replaced with proper clothes, bought discreetly from the department store in Pierre, and her sad eyes gradually brightened with the light of childhood restored. Michael, with Dorothy's encouragement, began using his financial expertise to help local farmers with their books. Working remotely to avoid detection, his knowledge of markets and investment strategies, when applied to agricultural concerns rather than high-stakes trading, proved invaluable to the community. The town, true to its nature, embraced them without asking too many questions. When rumors about the mysterious pair began to circulate, Dorothy shut them down with the authority that came from being one of Prairie Creek's most respected citizens. Their family, she would say simply, and in South Dakota, that was enough. Martha Jenkins at the diner took Sophie under her wing, teaching her to bake pies almost as good as Dorothy's. Sheriff Tom Burke, without making any official notes, began keeping an extra eye on Old Mill Road, especially at night. Even Linda, once skeptical of her mother's obsession, became protective of her new honorary sister and niece during her weekly visits from Rapid City. The prairie autumn painted the landscape in shades of gold and russet, and life settled into a new rhythm. Sophie enrolled in the local school under a carefully crafted story about being Dorothy's great niece. Her intelligence and quiet determination quickly won over her teachers and classmates alike. But shadows from the past weren't so easily dismissed. One crisp October morning, Dorothy spotted an unfamiliar car parked outside the diner, a black sedan with Illinois plates. Through the window, she could see two men in dark suits questioning Martha, who was giving them her best confused old lady routine. Dorothy's heart raced, but decades of nursing had taught her to keep her composure in crises. She walked calmly into the diner, nodding to Martha as she took her usual seat at the counter. "These gentlemen are looking for someone," Martha said, her voice carrying just the right note of small-town gossip. "A man and his daughter who might have passed through here." "Oh," Dorothy stirred cream into her coffee with steady hands. "Lots of folks pass through Prairie Creek. Don't usually pay much attention unless they stay." One of the men stepped forward, producing a photograph. This man would have been noticeable, well-dressed, driving a black Range Rover. Dorothy peered at the photo, a younger, more polished version of Michael, and shook her head. "Can't say I recall anyone like that, though my memory isn't what it used to be." "What did they do?" "The man owes some people a lot of money," the second man said smoothly. "We're just trying to help resolve the situation." "Well," Dorothy said, her voice taking on the stern tone that had cowed generations of Prairie Creek residents. "If you're looking to collect debts, you might want to try Pierre or Rapid City. Folks around here barely have 2 nickels to rub together most days." The men exchanged glances, clearly recognizing the subtle dismissal in her tone. They left shortly after, but Dorothy knew this wouldn't be the end. Winter descended on the prairie with its usual ferocity, transforming the landscape into a vast white expanse under steel-gray skies. The Blackwood house stood empty once again, its broken windows collecting snow. But now it held different memories, not of desperation and fear, but of a turning point, a place where one story had ended and another had begun. Dorothy's house, by contrast, had never felt more alive. Sophie's laughter echoed through rooms that had been too quiet for too long. Michael, though still cautious, had begun to relax, the haunted look in his eyes gradually fading. One evening, as snow fell softly outside, Dorothy sat in her rocking chair, watching Sophie help Michael decorate their first Christmas tree in 2 years. Mr. Whiskers purred contentedly in her lap, and the scent of apple pie, Sophie's latest attempt at mastering the recipe, filled the air. "You know," Michael said, hanging a handmade ornament Sophie had created at school, "when you first knocked on that door with your pie, I thought you were going to expose us, report us to someone." Dorothy chuckled. "Well,
Y admit y ad malacia suspicions.
spent months watching you, trying to figure out what nefarious activities you might be up to. Instead, you saved us," he said quietly. "No," Dorothy corrected him, reaching out to squeeze his hand. "You saved yourself and Sophie by being brave enough to accept help when it was offered. Sometimes the hardest thing isn't running from our problems. It's letting others help us face them." The sound of cars on the road made Michael tense instinctively, but Dorothy remained calm. "That'll be Linda and the kids," she said. "They're coming for Christmas Eve dinner. Remember, the evening that followed was filled with warmth, laughter, and the kind of joy that only family, whether by blood or by choice, could provide." Linda's children immediately pulled Sophie into their games, their shrieks of delight filling the house. "Michael," more relaxed than Dorothy had ever seen him, engaged in animated conversation with Linda's husband about local business opportunities. When spring finally returned to the prairie, bringing with it the sweet scent of renewal, much had changed. Michael's lawyer, working carefully through channels Dorothy's late husband had once established, had begun negotiations with his creditors. The men in dark suits no longer appeared in Prairie Creek, their attention drawn elsewhere by more promising leads. Michael had started his own financial consulting business, operating primarily online but with a growing local client base. His understanding of both high finance and rural economics made him uniquely valuable to farmers and ranchers looking to expand or modernize their operations. Sophie bloomed like the prairie wildflowers, her quiet demeanor giving way to the natural exuberance of childhood. She had friends now, a spot on the school soccer team, and dreams that extended beyond tomorrow's survival. Dorothy still sat on her porch most evenings, Mr. Whiskers dozing beside her as always. But now she watched different things, Sophie practicing soccer in the yard, Michael tending the vegetable garden they'd started. The normal rhythms of family life she'd thought had passed her by. "You know what, Mr. Whiskers?" she would sometimes say, scratching behind his ears. "Sometimes the best mysteries aren't the ones we solve, but the ones that solve us." And as the prairie wind whispered through the new grass, carrying the promise of summer to come, Dorothy Miller smiled, knowing that her greatest adventure had begun not with suspicion, but with an apple pie and an open heart.